In the months before his suicide in April 1945, Adolf Hitler was a physical wreck. As he faced military defeat, the 56-year-old Nazi leader looked like an old man. This was the all-powerful Führer who had started a world war and planned to create a master race. But in reality, Hitler was a hypochondriac who for years had been taking an extraordinary cocktail of drugs.
Amphetamines to be alert and active during the day, and then barbiturates, bromine, iodine. So Hitler was taking uppers and downers.
There must have been an element of dependence, if not addiction.
The man who supplied Hitler with these drugs was Dr. Theodor Morell.
He was, to a great part, a quack.
Hitler insisted he could not live without Morell. So what was the purpose of all the drugs Morell was giving the Führer? What diseases were they designed to cure? And what effect did his illnesses and the drugs he was taking have on the mind and the decisions of the ruthless dictator? Dr. Theodor Morell became Hitler's personal physician in 1936. Over the years, he pumped more than 60 drugs into the Führer. Some he injected daily. It was not always clear what the potions contained, but many believe that their impact may have influenced the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler.
He was taking all kinds of medication at the time. He was a good pill popper long before that.
Morell's unconventional practices earned him a dubious nickname among the Nazi elite.
Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall, gave him the nickname Reichsspritzenmeister. Spritzenmeister, injection is the Spritze, the Reichsmaster of injections.
But some of Morell's treatments were quite bizarre.
He was also very aggressive with unusual treatments, and that appealed to Hitler. Morell had such things in his arsenal as feces of a Bulgarian peasant or chopped up bull's testicles. So he treated Hitler with a lot of very unconventional medications.
One of the things that he enjoyed immensely is having put leech on him. He really wanted leeches for treatment.
There was also some secret around the whole treatment with Dr. Morell. He was, to a great part, a quack.
Der Führer im Kreise seiner Mitarbeiter.
This so-called quack became part of Hitler's inner circle, often seen in the background of newsreel film of the dictator. And it was Morell who held the secrets to the state of Hitler's mind and body over the last crucial decade of his life. The doctor and his wife were frequent visitors to Obersalzberg, Hitler's mountain retreat in southern Germany. But while he became a close confidant of Hitler, he was also loathed and envied for the power he appeared to have over the Führer.
Well, I think he was very dependent. Morell traveled with him. Morell spent basically 24 hours with him, so he was totally dependent on Morell. And he liked Morell. Morell was almost like Rasputin, almost in a way, some kind of Rasputin.
Those two men were very deeply involved. They had become a functioning unit, depraved, but nevertheless a functioning unit, and I don't think couldn't have done without one another at that time.
Before joining Hitler, Morell had a flourishing and exclusive practice in Berlin's swanky Kurfürstendamm. Even so, he was not the obvious choice as personal physician to the Führer.
Why then did he pick Morell, who had the habits of a pig? He was dirty, he was fat, he was unkempt, and very much opposed to Hitler's habits. Hitler changed his silk shirt twice a day.
He also had the unpleasant habit of not wanting to bathe. And so people didn't like to be around Theodor Morell very much. He was uniformly disliked in Hitler's circles but all except the man who really counted most, Adolf Hitler.
When Hitler first met Morell, the Fuhrer was at the height of his powers. This was how Hitler appeared to the German people in the 1930s. Little did they know that he was a hypochondriac already suffering from a string of debilitating and sometimes embarrassing illnesses.
His major problem is probably with his gastrointestinal tract, with his stomach, with his bowels. He's flatulent, he's constipated, and apparently this causes a great deal of discomfort to him.
This condition hardly squared with Hitler's need to present himself as the leader of a master race. He was concerned about his image. He feared putting on weight, and for years had been taking laxatives.
Became a laxative abuser, and mistaken idea that that would keep him from gaining weight. He was using them to kind of cheat nature, basically. Unsuccessfully, but that's what he was trying to do. Now this goes back to the first political campaigns, 1928 and onward. Laxative, I think, began this history in many ways.
Morell blamed Hitler's stomach problems in part on his vegetarian diet. He gave him what were called Dr. Koester's anti-gas pills for his flatulence. And also Mutaflor, the preparation made from the feces of Bulgarian peasants to combat the effect of the laxatives. The problem for Hitler's stomach, though, was that Morell was also giving him painkillers to help alleviate the painful stomach cramps. And these had quite the opposite effect to the laxatives. Hitler's gut was in a vicious cycle.
He was taking laxatives on one hand to clear his gut and taking painkillers on the other hand, which will cause his gut to seize up. So I think in a sense that I don't think his gut knew what to do next. It was a very unpleasant situation, I should imagine. I'm not surprised he had wind.
Despite Morell's unconventional methods, Hitler fell under his spell. But Hitler's stomach complaints were the least of the problems facing Morell. Nazi propaganda tried to maintain the myth of the invincible dictator. The truth was different. Hitler was suffering from not one, but several serious medical conditions that may have determined the outcome of the two most decisive battles of the Second World War. You are watching High Hitler here on the History Channel.
Breslau, die 7. Sommerkampfspiele der Hitlerjugend. Gymnastikvorführungen der Mädel.
One reason for Hitler's obsession with the working of his own body might have been that biology and medicine were central to the Nazi project.
Vorführungen der Gruppe Turnen.
This was the Hitler Youth, the organization that would re-educate the young of Germany into the ideals of the National Socialist Party. It was designed to create a new kind of human being, the embodiment of health and racial purity.
Wurde in Serbien der serbische Aufbaudienst eingeführt.
Nazi Germany was based
Durch den Bau von Entwässerungs-
on a biological racism. And initially he was talking about the physically defective, mentally defective, and that was really the first euthanasia program that comes out of this line of thinking. And then he goes on to the gas chambers and to the concentration camps.
But what if the Fuhrer himself failed to live up to the Nazi ideal? What if his physical and mental performance proved inadequate? The answer to these questions might explain the curious choice of Dr. Theodor Morell as his personal physician. Morell could be trusted to keep secret the truth of Hitler's failing health and the lengths to which he was prepared to go to ensure Hitler had the energy and drive to lead Germany through the war. Berlin fell in 1945. Shortly after, Dr. Erwin Giesing, a specialist who had treated Hitler with cocaine for ear and sinus problems, gave evidence to his American interrogators. A report he had written a year earlier described Hitler's attraction to certain medications. Not that Hitler was your common drug addict, he said, but his neuropathic constitution led to his finding certain drugs particularly pleasurable. Was this the secret that Morell had been keeping for nearly a decade? He had turned Hitler into a drug addict.
He took a number of drugs that were addictive. He took them so frequently that there must have been an element of dependence, if not addiction. Of course, the opiates and the codeine were addictive. He also gave Hitler cocaine, which is also addictive. Sedatives for insomnia, stimulants for being more up to an occasion.
In 1936, the same year as the explosive Nuremberg rally, a new drug came onto the scene, one that might have appealed to Hitler.
I think, as I look at the evidence, amphetamines became available in 1936 for the general public. And they received immense publicity. Extolled as a miracle drug, a cure for fatigue. And I suspect that Hitler was always interested in medical problems and new things, and I suspect that he probably wanted to try them.
The evidence is that Hitler indeed found the new drug irresistible. In 1938, the King of Italy told his foreign minister that Hitler was being injected with narcotics and stimulants. There was further evidence in 1939 that Morell had routine access to stimulant drugs. Europe was on the brink of war when the German army marched triumphantly into the Sudetenland in western Czechoslovakia. The previous day, though, the Czech president, under threat of an all-out invasion, was subjected to a verbal tirade from Hitler and collapsed. Hitler called for Morell, who administered a mysterious injection. Immediately afterwards, it was said the Czech president became fresh and alert. Hitler joked that the injection had made him too lively. He was worried he would not sign the surrender document. So what were in these injections? There are clues in the diaries that Morell began to keep from 1941 onwards. These show that for years, Morell was supplying Hitler with a concoction called Vitamultin, which he gave him both as pills and routine injections. But what did Vitamultin contain? Hitler's staff had vital evidence, especially his valet, Heinz Linge.
It was a very surprising interview. Linge said, among other things, that every morning before Hitler got out of bed, he had an injection for Morell. So I asked him what happened. Linge said, he got immediately alert, alive, fresh, ready for the day, while the needle was still in the arm. And so that alerted me, because there's just nothing else that would have that kind of effect. It had to be a stimulant drug of the amphetamine class.
Other members of Hitler's staff support the valet's description of the impact of the injections and Hitler's reaction.
One of his secretaries described this vividly, that he would look like a defeated man, and then he'd get an injection, and then all at once he was his old self again and in command of the situation. Expressed profuse gratitude to Morell for Morell, you're a savior. Morell, you saved me again. Morell, I don't know how I got through the night, but here you are, and you've cured me.
Morell was secretive about what precisely was in the Vitamultin. He admitted only that it contained a variety of vitamins. In tablet form, Morell delivered the preparation to Hitler in gold-wrapped packages. In 1943, Professor Ernst Gunther Schenk, a nutrition expert for the SS and jealous of Morell's compound, managed to obtain some of the gold-wrapped pills. He sent them away for analysis. What he found was shocking. You are watching Hi Hitler, here on the History Channel. Since Dr. Theodor Morell had become his personal physician, Adolf Hitler had received almost daily doses of a special cocktail of drugs called Vitamultin. Now its secrets were about to be revealed by the actions of Professor Ernst Gunther Schenk.
Hitler's special preparation was sent to a chemist for analysis, and it contained the vitamins as specified and Pervitin, which is the German trade name for methamphetamine. Complete surprise to Schenk. He didn't suspect anything like that.
When Schenk reported the analysis to his superiors, he was ordered to forget the subject altogether. But Schenk's findings made more sense than Morell's insistence that the mysterious pills contained only vitamins. There is confirmation that Morell was also giving Hitler Vitamultin by injection in one of the early entries in his diaries. On August 7, 1941, he wrote, "Injected Vitamultin, calcium, and glyconorm. Bent the needle on insertion." Over the following years, this type of entry was repeated time and time again.
Almost daily gave him preparation for Hitler. Always when Hitler said, "I am to fatigue," or he a bad mood, this was the same. Morell gave him golden Vitamultin.
Outside Stalingrad, the icy winter becomes a fiery hell.
If Hitler was taking amphetamines, it's likely that his dependency damaged his judgment. The disastrous battle for Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-43 provides the best example of how Hitler's amphetamine abuse may have influenced the course of the war. The defeat at Stalingrad marked a decisive turning point. The Eastern Front had always been critical to Germany's military ambitions. At first, Hitler and his generals thought the city could be taken within days. Instead, the battle descended first into hand-to-hand fighting and then into a long and brutal siege.
At the time the Stalingrad disaster was taking shape, Hitler was, I think, in a hypomanic state. He would, any flimsy excuse that would keep the army advancing and not permitting retreat, he seized upon it. Optimism prevails. It's a time of exalted feeling, exalted power. It's the sort of thing that amphetamine produces. This kind of optimism produces errant judgment. Hitler's behavior, and it really was quite consistent with an amphetamine intoxication.
And on February the 2nd, 1943, after 162 days of the heaviest fighting in the history of warfare, Stalingrad is free. The Nazis had capitulated.
Hitler certainly misjudged the Stalingrad campaign. His strategy was marked by a disastrous combination of indecision and stubborn inflexibility.
These are the men who had been promised that as conquerors they would winter in Stalingrad.
At first, Hitler was hopelessly optimistic. Then, as the position of the German forces deteriorated, he became absurdly single-minded, refusing to entertain any thoughts of retreat. The Stalingrad offensive started on November 21st. On November 23rd, Morell noted in his diary that Hitler was getting very little sleep. He gave the Fuhrer what he called the usual injections.
When the reverses kick in, it must have been stressful for him too. And I suspect that as things go from bad to worse. The stress is built up on him and he becomes more dependent both on Morell and his pharmacopoeia.
The strains of the defeat at Stalingrad, which for the first time brought criticism from his generals, took their toll on Hitler's health, and especially his heart. In fact, Morell had given Hitler an electrocardiogram test over a year earlier. Coronary sclerosis was diagnosed. But it was not until December 17, 1942, that Morell discussed with Hitler this potentially dangerous condition. He noted in his diary, "Führer wants to be told whether his conditions would be very bad because he would have to make important decisions regarding Germany. He does not fear death. It would be a relief for him. He lives only for the fatherland." For a period after Stalingrad, it appears that Morell withdrew the Vitamultin. But it was not long before Morell reintroduced his magic remedy, and by 1944, he has a more mysterious version of the Vitamultin calcium that he had been giving Hitler for the previous 6 years. On March 14, 1944, while at Obersalzberg, Morell injected Hitler with a different form of the drug. He wrote in his diary that he gave patient A, as he called him, a shot of Vitamultin Forte for the first time, adding, he came to life at once. There's one final piece of evidence to suggest that Morell's tablets contained amphetamines.
Amphetamine is a drug that induces tolerance. That is, it takes additional drug to produce the same effect. And Morell himself said that he had to increase the volume, 2 cc's, 4 cc's, and so on. And he was talking about Vitamultin. You don't develop tolerance to vitamins, but vitamin injections, but you do amphetamine. Many other observers said, too, that Hitler had to have increasingly more drug to get the same effect. And of those drugs capable of producing addiction in those days, why, it would be amphetamine would be by far the most likely.
By the end of 1944, Hitler was living with another symptom that has puzzled medical investigators. For at least 3 years, Hitler had suffered from tremors in his hands and legs. What could have been the cause? And was it a sign of a deterioration in his mental powers? You are watching Hi Hitler here on the History Channel. As the Allies closed in on Germany in late 1944 and early 1945, Adolf Hitler was reduced to a physical wreck, a shuffling walk, a pronounced stoop, and above all, tremors that made him seem weak and frail. His eyesight also began to weaken, though like much else concerning Hitler's failing health, it was kept from the German people. The comparison with the man whose energy and charisma had threatened the world could not have been more obvious. There was one diagnosis, however, that might account for these symptoms: Parkinson's disease, the chronic brain disorder that wastes body and mind.
For such a superman as Hitler, Parkinson is of course not a very sympathetic disorder, because this trembling and from 42 also slightly four-bent corpse, and later this shuffling of the feet, and so that is of course in the eyes of his admirers is of course a very bad.
As early as August 11th, 1941, Dr. Theodor Morell wrote in his diary about a new symptom that would in time grip the Führer. His entry simply said, "Left hand shows a tremor."
The tremor of Parkinson is what we call a resting tremor. It's when the hands are at rest, not at action. We often notice in videotapes that Adolf Hitler carries something in his left hand. This is in fact a very common technique for a Parkinsonian to use in order to suppress the tremor. But in addition, there are many other symptoms that come on, perhaps the earliest being a lack of arm swing. In the most advanced state, in fact, the state Adolf Hitler shows in the last weeks of his life, there's really no question but that he was suffering from Parkinsonism.
From Stalingrad onwards, his condition deteriorated progressively. By the spring of 1944, Morell noticed a pronounced tremor in Hitler's legs. He wrote in his diary on May 9th, "Patient A has a headache on his left side. His legs are trembling. Invasion imminent. But where?"
It was like a convulsion of nature.
Within a month, Allied troops had landed on the beaches of Normandy.
Our first assault wave had a full share of heartbreaking misadventures. Plunging fire from enemy batteries was extremely accurate. Our casualties were high.
Hitler's response was fatally slow. There was one obvious reason why. The night before the invasion, Hitler was at Obersalzberg and, as usual, had been up late talking. His propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, wrote in his diary, "We sit together before the fireplace and reminisce." While the beaches were being overrun, Hitler slept in and could not be disturbed. But there was also a medical reason for Hitler's failure to react to the D-Day landings.
The earliest that we suspect Adolf Hitler showed signs of Parkinsonism was 1934. By the Battle of Normandy in 1944, Adolf Hitler would have had his Parkinson's for over 10 years. We found in our study that all of our patients who had had Parkinson's disease for over 10 years showed a mental inflexibility or difficulty in concept formation. This, we think, may well have had an effect on Hitler's judgment at the Battle of Normandy, and particularly his slowness to release adequate forces to repulse the invasion. 6:30 a.m. June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed ashore on the beaches of Normandy. Very shortly thereafter, the call went in from the German defenders asking for reinforcements, and he refused. It was his belief that the battle was to be fought at Calais. He thought this was a diversion. The next day, another request went in for reinforcements. Again, Adolf Hitler refused. The following day, or some 48 hours after the battle had begun, reluctantly, Adolf Hitler released only 2 of the 6 panzer divisions that were being held in reserve, never released the reserves of the 15th Army.
Deutsche Panzer, Sturmgeschütze und Artillerie auf Selbstparapette stoßen im Raum von Bayeux zum Gegenangriff gegen britisch-amerikanische Einheiten vor.
His response was, in fact, too little, too late. The Second Front had been established, and many believe predetermined the outcome of World War II.
The bomb-blasted room where an explosion nearly got Hitler. See's Nazi film pictures the scene. German generals...
In the summer of 1944, with the German Reich facing defeat, there was a dramatic attempt to blow up Hitler. The bomb killed and maimed members of the Nazi inner circle. Footage at the time shows Hitler looking stooped and old as he visited the injured. But he himself escaped from the blast virtually unscathed. Within hours of the attack, Hitler was meeting the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Curiously, immediately after the blast, Hitler's tremors disappeared.
These are the last motion pictures that we have had of Hitler, who is now rumored to be dead or insane after overwhelming defeats.
But by September, the tremors were back. And in January 1945, as the Allies advanced into German territory, Morell wrote in his diary, in consequence of the critical military situation, a stronger tremor has appeared in the left arm and leg. But still Morell had not diagnosed these tremors as Parkinson's disease. This footage is a rare piece of film which escaped the Nazi censors. Shot in early 1945, it shows quite clearly the tremors from which Hitler was suffering.
Focus in on his left hand. There it is, that slow tremor. It's flexion extension movements of the fingers, very typical for Parkinson's disease. Toward the end of the war, the censorship system was beginning to break down, and that's when we really have the best evidence of his tremor.
Shortly before Hitler's suicide, Morell took action. On April 2nd, 1945, he wrote, "The tremor in his left hand was very marked." 2 weeks later, he gave Hitler injections of Hamburg 680, then the standard treatment for Parkinson's. But there is another explanation for Hitler's tremors, and one that fits with the view that he was dependent on the amphetamines dished out by Morell. The amphetamine Pervitin in Hitler's Vitamoltin tablets had been restricted by law. To avoid a scandal, even the Führer could only obtain it by a clandestine route. So the Vitamoltin tablets were specially produced for Hitler by a chemist employed by Morell. But with the wartime shortage of chemicals, how pure was this amphetamine?
It's not easy making methamphetamine. Who knows what kind of substitutions they had to make for ingredients. And in particular, Escasy has been widely reported, which is one of the side products.
It's possible that he might have been ingesting a toxic side product which could have started to degrade his Parkinson-type neurons. Once those neurons go with this toxin, that's it. They go forever. They don't recover.
At the end of 1944, Morell was accused by fellow doctors, led by Dr. Karl Brandt, of trying to poison Hitler. But the source of the charge was not impure amphetamines, but another seemingly harmless tablet Hitler was taking for his flatulence. Hitler had Dr. Koester's anti-gas pills delivered each day with his breakfast. These were found to contain 0.5 gram of strychnine and 0.5 gram of deadly nightshade, over time enough to be toxic.
They actually believed that Morell might be poisoning Hitler, even suspected that he might be an Allied spy, and was slowly poisoning him with some substance.
They confronted Morell. Morell became very upset. He does record his upset in the diary. And so they all went to see Hitler, and Hitler fired them all, kept Morell.
It seems extraordinary that Hitler sided with Morell over his arguably more eminent rivals. But there may have been a reason why Hitler needed Morell so badly. What if the Führer suffered from a deadly condition which must at all costs be kept secret? You are watching Hi Hitler, here on the History Channel. So why did Adolf Hitler remain so ferociously loyal to his physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, a man loathed, suspected, and envied by most of those closest to the Führer? The answer to this question leads to another deadly disease from which Hitler may have been suffering. Morell's fashionable practice in Berlin included treating the rich and famous for venereal diseases. Indeed, Morell met Hitler when treating his personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, for gonorrhea.
We come to 1937. He picks Dr. Morell, who's an expert and one of the leading practitioners of syphilology in Berlin. My own sense is that if he were not thinking of syphilis, if he didn't think he might have had it, he would have picked a doctor, a physician with a different specialty.
When Morell first started treating him, Hitler had two complaints. One were skin lesions on his shins, and the other was gastrointestinal pain that came and went. It was so extreme that he was reported as saying that he sometimes wanted to scream. That was one of the main clues of syphilis to a syphilologist of the time.
When Hitler hired Morell as his physician, he gave him a lakeside villa in the exclusive Schwanenwörde district of Berlin. Was this a payoff for keeping secret the unthinkable? The Fuhrer was infected with syphilis? It was already clear that Hitler was obsessed by the deadly potency of syphilis. He had written at length about it in Mein Kampf. Syphilis was the greatest threat to racial purity. Above all, it was a Jewish disease.
He spends 13, 14 really passionate pages on syphilis. Syphilis is sinful, it's in the blood. It desecrates the Aryan race, and the ultimate goal of the National Socialist agenda is to combat syphilis. Unless he had some special interest in it or some special significance, there was no reason in this book to pay any attention to syphilis.
Der Führer bei Besprechungen mit dem Reichsführer SS, Reichsinnenminister Himmler.
There had always been rumors that Hitler had been infected by a prostitute in his youth. But there's one crucial piece of evidence involving the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, one of the Nazi leaders closest to Hitler. Himmler kept a secret dossier on Hitler's health. Some of its contents were revealed in the diaries of Himmler's masseur, Felix Kirsten.
Kirsten had two diary entries recording conversations that he had with Himmler. The essence of the conversations were that Himmler was very concerned that he had gotten a secret report saying that Hitler was in the late stages of syphilis.
This was how Kirsten reported the contents of Himmler's medical dossier. In 1937, symptoms appeared which proved that syphilis was evidently continuing its ravages. And at the beginning of 1942, symptoms of a similar nature showed beyond any shadow of doubt that Hitler was suffering from progressive paralysis. Every symptom was present, except for fixity of vision and confusion of speech.
Interestingly, Kirsten, in the published memoir, didn't put the authors of the report, but a Catholic theologian years later went to Kirsten's archive with the permission of his widow and found that the two doctors who signed the report were Morell and Karl Brandt, Hitler's two doctors at the end.
The discovery of who was responsible for the report was shocking.
The fact that on the eve of the Battle of Stalingrad, Morell was willing to sign a document to Himmler saying that there was an imminent catastrophe, that Hitler's health was at the final stages and that Himmler had to know it. This is quite remarkable.
Morell was able to put his name to the Himmler dossier because he knew the medical evidence, especially about Hitler's heart, that supported the syphilis diagnosis.
He put a great store by heart sounds, and a particular heart sound which he felt was typical of cardiovascular syphilis. It's worth saying that at this time, cardiovascular syphilis was the commonest cause of cardiac disease, and so someone like Morell, whose bread and butter was dealing with syphilis, probably had a very kind of acute awareness of what the ways of diagnosing it were.
In syphilis, this structure, the aorta, becomes big, balloons up. It's called an aneurysm. Consequently, the aortic valve beneath it also stretches, and the valve does not prevent backflow. So with each beat of the heart, the left ventricle, or the major pumping chamber of the heart, has to pump twice as much blood as normal. Heart dilates, the muscle becomes weak, and eventually the heart fails.
This is what Hitler's heart sounded like, with its distinctive abnormal beat that could indicate the terminal state of coronary syphilis.
It was found by a particular heart sound that required very careful technique to hear, and Morel apparently heard it. It was the altered second tympanic aortic heart sound. And Morel in his journals over and over and over again found this sign, and he treated Hitler with the treatment of choice at the time in the 1940s in Germany, and that was an iodide salt. It was called Septoid, and he injected it in Hitler sometimes 2 and 3 times a day. Second heartbeat accentuated, intravenous shot of 10 cc's of 20% glucose solution and Septoid. Took his blood pressure, it's 170 to 180. Gave him 2 intravenous shots of 10 cc's of Septoid. I made an electrocardiogram, first and second lead, strong muscle current, Septoid 10 cc's.
But if Hitler's heart disease seems a persuasive diagnosis, there's one problem with the syphilis theory. In January 1940, Morel sent off a sample of Hitler's blood for what is known as the Wassermann test. It came back negative.
The invention of the Wassermann test was a gigantic step forward, because here for the first time was a good way of diagnosing syphilis without actually having to have obvious syphilis in front of you. But it had some major limitations. Very often that test could be positive when you didn't have syphilis, and later on in syphilis, when you had late manifestation of syphilis, the test could come back negative.
So the bottom line is, the absence of a positive blood test for syphilis does not rule out the disease.
If Hitler was suffering from tertiary syphilis, the tantalizing question remains whether the disease might have begun to take its toll on the Führer's central nervous system. Were the tremors and the ravings, especially in the last years of his life, the symptoms of a man ravaged by syphilis?
During the latent phase, which is 20-30 years, there should not have been any noticeable impact on his health. But once the tertiary stage kicks in, it can affect his heart and his mental function.
This is the last known footage of Hitler, shot just a few weeks before he committed suicide. He's 56, but looking older and weaker than his years. This shuffling, hunched figure was the man who claimed to be creating a master race. As the Allies closed in on Berlin in the spring of 1945, Hitler summoned Morel to his bunker beneath the city. The time had come to dispense with the services of the man who for a decade had kept his body and mind going to pursue the Nazi project. But Morel's quackery, incompetence, or worse, finally came back to haunt him.
In the bunker, the other persons, Goebbels, all in this one, were informed that Eva Braun had the suspicion Morel probably would try to poison Hitler.
Hitler told Morel to get out of his uniform and go back to his practice in Berlin's Kurfürstendamm. On April 21st, 1945, Morel wrote simply in his diary, "Dismissed." Two days later, Morel flew out of Berlin and headed back to the mountains of Bavaria, near Obersalzberg, where he had spent so many happy times with the Führer. It was the end of an extraordinary relationship that might in some way have determined the course of World War II. A week later, Hitler had put a bullet through his right temple. Morel was picked up by the Allies, interrogated, and released. He died 3 years after Hitler, leaving only his diary as a clue to the secret illnesses of his Führer.
Facts provoke thought. Thought spurs questions. Questions ignite controversy. Make up your own mind. Conspiracy, next, only on the History Channel.